In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a podcast in Sim Theory based on either a conversation or getting your assistant to go off and do research about a topic that you might be interested in, and then creating a podcast in a style that you like, allowing you to listen to it. But also, if you want to publish it on Apple Podcast or Spotify, I'll show you how to do that as well. It's pretty cool. You can get it to create cover art, create the podcast, do the research, and then publish it to a particular podcast service that we've integrated with called Transistor, which we actually use for our This Day in AI podcast. So the first thing that you need to do is go down to the MCP config button here. You can click Manage Connections, and at the time of recording, this is going to be under What's New, but you might have to search for it a little bit later on if you're watching this video. So we're going to click Install Podcast Maker, and we'll add a connection to Podcast Maker, and you'll see it is now active in our account. And this means we can now use the Podcast Maker to create podcasts with our assistant. So the next thing we're going to do is, instead of just ask it to make a podcast now, I'm going to go into my assistant selection tool here and click Create a New Assistant. And I'm going to create an assistant called Podcast Maker. And the reason I'm going to do this is I want to restrict the MCPs or the tools that my podcast maker can use, just so I know it's using the different tools that I want it to use. So under MCPs, I'm going to switch restrict access to specific MCPs on, and then I'm going to choose the podcast maker. And I also want to do some research before my episodes, which I'll demonstrate. So I want it to have the ability to crawl websites. So I'll give it Firecrawl. I'll give it Perplexity Deep Research. I also would like to give it access to Google Search, because I think that'll come in handy as well. Deep Search, X Deep Search here as well. And maybe some image tools like Ideogram as well to create some cover art. You could do Imagen 4 or GPT Image if you prefer that. And I'm also going to give it access to Transistor, which is another MCP I already installed before this video. Now, with Transistor, you do need an API key and you do need an account for Transistor in order to publish podcasts. So you'll need to set up that separately, but it's the same process I showed you as implementing the podcast maker here. Now, another configuration setting you can do in Assistants now is you can set a default model for the assistant. So you could go ahead here and select something like Claude 4 Sonnet or any model that you prefer. It doesn't have to be this one. So once you select it, you'll see our default model is selected and our assistant is now selected. And if I click the MCP button here, you'll see all of those MCPs that I selected previously are now isolated to this assistant. So it's only going to be able to use these MCPs when the master switch for this assistant up here is on. So there's a few different ways of creating the podcast. You can do it in one shot where you say, go research something, create the podcast and publish it and create cover art. And it's able to very competently go and do all of that. But in my case, I like getting a draft first, just so I can get an idea of what it's going to create before I commit to the podcast. So for my first prompt, I'm going to say, I want to make a podcast that explains MCP, Model Context Protocol. Can you research this and create a draft script for me to review? Ideally, the podcast would be 2 minutes in length. So let's do that first. Okay, so our research is now complete. It scanned multiple sources to do research on the Model Context Protocol and create a script for 2 minutes duration. So we can review the script. We could, in theory, make some changes. We've got a lot of source data here, which is great. But let's just go ahead now for the sake of demonstration and create the podcast. So we'll say, okay, create this exact script using 2 female hosts. Now, you can ask it to create a podcast with a single male host, a single female host, 2 male hosts, 2 female hosts. And you can also give it a tune. So you can say, I want it to be comedic. I want it to be professional. I want it to be sophisticated. If you don't say any of these things, it will just try and figure out what your intention is based on what you're creating a podcast about. Okay, so we've got our 2-minute podcast on MCP in the girl style, and this is a comedic duo tune of 2 female hosts. So let's give it a listen.
All right, Laura, buckle up. Today we're diving into the tech acronym to end all tech acronyms, MCP. MCP.
MCP? Please don't tell me it's another cryptocurrency. My digital wallet is emotionally exhausted.
No, not even close. It's the Model Context Protocol. And it's actually solving one of the biggest headaches with AI.
Oh, you mean the brilliant but trapped in a time capsule problem? Where you ask an AI about last night's news and it confidently tells you what happened in early 2023?
Okay, so you get the idea. So it creates a pretty engaging podcast with two female hosts. And now, if you want to focus on the podcast clip, you can actually see the script that it's followed and the script that it's come up with based on the earlier research and script that we did. So that's a way of just seeing the a rundown of that entire script. Now, if we didn't like this tune, we could ask it to make the podcast longer, or we could ask it to do it with different hosts or make it funnier or whatever we want and iterate and work our way through the podcast here. But I'm going to show you something a little bit different here. So now let's imagine we want to post this to a podcast that I created earlier, a show in Transistor called Learn About AI. So to do that, I'm going to just ask it to publish this to that Transistor show. So my prompt says, create some cover art for this episode and publish this show as episode 1 to my Transistor show, Learn About AI. Okay, so it's come up with some cover art here, understanding the Model Context Protocol. I think this is pretty good. And now it's using Transistor to create episode 1 of the show and actually publish it. So you can see it's put it in a draft format, which is probably a good thing. And it's created the cover art just to make sure that I'm happy with it. So you can see it's also given it an episode description here. It's done all the work for us. And if we look over here in Transistor and then go into our episodes here, you'll see we have one draft show in here, understanding the Model Context Protocol. And it's also got our cover art in here, a description, and you can see the audio file has been uploaded in here as well. It's pretty cool. So now let's just say, okay, go ahead and publish it. Okay, so our episode is now published. It's even given us a link of where we can go and find it on Transistor, which is pretty cool. So let's go to that link. So here's our published episode. We can listen to it a little bit here.
Laura, buckle up.
Same episode we heard before, obviously. And then I haven't actually connected this through Transistor to distribute on Spotify or Apple Podcasts because obviously for the purposes of demoing this, I don't want to do it. But if you had them connected now, this would be published. It would be sent out to your subscribers and you would have released a new episode of a podcast, which is pretty cool. So this is something you can do all the way from researching an idea to getting the AIs to record a podcast that is pretty high quality and then publish it complete with cover art. Now, you can also, the tool is pretty advanced. If you had your own cover art designer, you wanted to control that a little bit more, you could just drag and drop the image in that you created and the podcast episode as well and just ask it to publish it that way as well. So it would work either way. And of course, I encourage you to experiment around with different podcast tunes. They can go for up to 60 minutes, believe it or not. They can also be very short. There's single narrators and obviously the different duo combinations. And you can just ask it about the options it has, the MCP, the podcast MCPs. You can just say, tell me the options for podcast style. In fact, let's do that now. Okay, so you can see if you just ask it, it gives you a sense of what you can do with the podcast maker. So you can give it an explicit topic, a contextual topic, like turn this conversation into a podcast. Podcast can range from 2 to 60 minutes. Default's 5 minutes if you don't specify. You've got comedic, professional, sophisticated, male narrator, female narrator, the girls and the guys, which is meant to be like a dynamic duo there as well. And by default, the tunes are 2 hosts unless you tell it to specify a single narrator, like a male or female narrator. That's actually good for storytelling if you want to use a single narrator, like you want to do a crime podcast or just have it create some sort of ebook for you and you listen to that back. So lots of options for you. I hope you enjoyed creating your very own podcast with the Podcast MCP. It's now available on Sim Theory exclusively in the MCP store. So just search for Podcast Maker. You'll find it in the store. I'll put a link in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one.